Tomorrow is Arbor Day, and Tim just told me that it's the 150th anniversary of Arbor Day, so it's pretty special. So thank you, Tim, for doing this, and thank you all so much for joining. And again, please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. All right, thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Liz. I really appreciate it. And we'll get started. This is a beautiful tree planting in the Philadelphia suburb called Swarthmore College. And it's one of the examples of how they selected a tree. It's not really an urban site, and that's kind of what we're talking about today, urban sites, which are challenging. But this is a swamp white oak. And you don't see it very often planted on Martha's Vineyard. Actually, there's one of them that's planted in the traffic circle in Oak Bluffs that was labeled white oak mistakenly. But it's called swamp white oak because it grows in swamps. And this is kind of related to how we select urban trees by their origins and how they've adapted in an evolutionary sense to grow in wet soils. So I'll talk about that, but what Liz just mentioned, which is really cool, this is the 150th year of the establishment of Arbor Day. And big question is, where did it start? And it started because of this man, Julius Sterling Morton, who was an industrial businessman and from Nebraska City, Nebraska, which is a plain state. So there weren't that many trees that grew out there. And he noticed the effect of having trees and shades in these little towns in the Midwest. He also had a prominent place in terms of his own political stature besides his wealth. And he was the third United States Secretary of Agriculture. And he promoted that there be a day set aside, which the legislation took on, to have a day where we celebrate and plant trees. And his legacy, as I'll show you in a moment, is still here today because Arbor Day is in every state in the United States. And it's usually this time, the third week or fourth week of April. He also founded Arbor Lodge State Historical Park and Arboretum on the old home site of the Mortons. So he's the guy that really kind of set the pace for people planting trees, and particularly street trees, as we'll talk about in a moment. He's also, he had 4 sons, and one of them was Joy Morton, who is here planting trees. And it kind of looked like he usually has somebody else plant the tree for him. He's a little grumpy. But he, along with his father and his 3 brothers, had founded this Morton Salt Company. So for those of you familiar with this logo here on the side of the salt can of the Morton Salt Company, that's how they acquired their wealth. Well, Joy Morton, pictured here, was the founder of the Morton Arboretum, which is in Lisle, Illinois, about 25 miles west of Chicago. And it's a place that I had the wonderful opportunity, and I'm very grateful to work for nearly 4.5 years, 1998 to 2002, before I came here. And I learned a lot about urban street trees because the Morton Arboretum is really the leading tree authority in terms of how trees will grow in cities and their challenges. They have several PhDs. One of them is on our board, and that's Dr. Murphy Westwood, who is the head of research there now. Here's a picture of the Morton Arboretum in its very beginnings in 1922. And what's really quite cool is it's the 100th anniversary of the Morton Arboretum. And today they have a lot of science going on in several areas: conservation biology, conservation of rare and endangered trees. We work with them on endangered oak species and other trees. So the Morton Arboretum, 100 years old, is a big player in what we call urban horticulture, particularly street trees. One of our own past interns, Matthew Lobdell, who's from West Tisbury here on the island, is their director of collections, and he's involved with oaks, magnolias, and several other trees that are struggling in the wild. And he's also a person who helps select trees for their urban toughness. Another place that really has been a leader in terms of street trees, particularly in New York City, is Cornell University, Dr. Nina Bassick. And Dr. Bassick has done a long study of street trees in the Northeast and in the Midwest, and had determined very early on in the early 80s that the typical lifespan of an urban tree is less than 15 years. There's several challenges to urban trees and the locations they grow. I'll get into those in a moment, but sometimes they live less than 5 to 7 years. Really, what we don't do well as a country, in a general sense, is invest in our green cities. And you're seeing more of that now with climate change coming, that if you don't have street trees in a city, the temperatures can be 15 to 20 degrees hotter. So trees are of great value. However, they're often planted poorly. They're often put into situations that they're never going to survive. And oftentimes they're not even watered. So it's all about selecting the right tree and giving it the aftercare to see it grow. I have a little story from my home where I grew up in Grand Rapids. This giant tree that you see here is a metasequoia. This isn't the right tree in the right place. It used to be over here and the city made me move it. It's about 87 feet tall. It's a clonal form of it called National from the National Arboretum that thankfully grows upright. And here's a red bud that's called Joyce Pride, released by the Morton Arboretum. But across the street, I was very fortunate and really kind of added to my love of trees that I had this park to hang out in. But all along here, along the street tree planting way, was American elm. And in 1970, the Dutch elm disease came through. And I remember one day, the city came through and I was like 9 years old and painted every one of the trees with a red X. And then the next day they came and they cut them all down. They put them in this park across the street and lit them on fire. It was kind of like a rude awakening. And then of course I noticed immediately that the shade had been gone. So tree diversity, why does it matter? When you plant all of one type of tree, you're setting yourself up for a massive loss of those trees, because not all trees are non-susceptible to diseases. So the theme would be right tree, right place. But the key thing is to realize is there's no perfect tree for every situation, but they're trees that will match site conditions and limitations based on a site assessment. But diversity, not adversity, is what I say, is the key to success. Overplanting of one species, like the American elm, is an area that can result in monocultures that encourage insect populations to come in and just destroy the entire planting. So tree diversity, a strategy that urban horticulturists and scientists have realized, is that you need to limit any one species to between 5 and 10% of a total urban population. That helps you when you have a disease or insect that comes in and could wipe out 90 to 95% of the tree population. If it was all one type of species. And so if you have 5 to 10%, you still have of one in a mix of species, you have 90 to 95% of your canopy enduring and moving forward and living. But most urban areas, perhaps only 5 or fewer species make up the great majority of trees planted. In the town of West Tisbury, probably 80%, I haven't counted them all, are Norway maples or sycamore leaf maples. Here's a story, though, about the American elm, just going back to it. So American elm had gotten a disease called Dutch elm disease, which I'll explain in a moment. But this is kind of what my street trees looked like along my street in Grand Rapids with these arching canopies. Here's an elm-lined street, the same one in 1971. And then the same view in 1984, you notice the difference in the open nature of what happened with the loss of those trees. Here's a picture from Edward Luce right here on Martha's Vineyard of Alleys, the store in the heart of the old section of town with American elms. And this is between, they guesstimate, between 1890 and 1940. I would probably say it's early 1900s. Those trees are gone. And what happened is they planted Norway maples in their place in abundance. And then those trees came in and seeded all over. And so that's why we have so many in our old part of town. What happened with the elm, though, is very curious. It's called Dutch elm disease because actually it at first was identified there by a scientist in the Netherlands, in fact. And so a great scientist, had discovered that Dutch elm disease had come in on timber from China. And the first round of that was about 1927, but it was followed by a more deadly version of it that was more virulent, meaning it could spread more readily likely in the 1940s, and then it started to become dominant. And one thing is, it took out, thousands of street trees, but it also killed millions of trees that were naturally occurring in the forest. They call that a demographic decline. So what happened is this fungus came in the wood. It was spread by elm bark beetles from tree to tree. And then when I show you this classic elm shape, the roots of the trees underneath, not far from each other in a street tree planted, grafted together underground, and through the vascular system spread the disease down the entire street. So it's quite devastating to see. This is a nice story about elms, though, on Martha's Vineyard. And in a July 3rd edition of the Vineyard Gazette in 1987, it's a story about the return of the elm to the streets of Vineyard Haven. And years ago, Nancy Weaver had shown me some of these trees. And indeed, they came from the Morton Arboretum from a dendrologist who at that time was the head of the research department, Dr. George Ware, who I had really the privilege to work with for my 4 years there, and also was on a street tree committee with him. So Dr. Ware discovered that if we were going to try to find a new elm that would survive and do well, what we should do is go to the source of where it evolved, and that was China. So Dr. Ware went to China and he found several species. And what had happened naturally occurring over time is the species became resistant and new populations formed that had a resistance to Dutch elm disease. So he started to hybridize these trees, and lo and behold, he released several elms, and several of his trees are in Vineyard Haven. I'm not certain of this. Dr. Ware also had given trees to the town of Vineyard Haven in a larger sense. I'll get to that in a moment. But he had started his career in 1968 and he retired in 1995. Now, he worked there in retirement for several years, but he established a reputation for finding trees that could take these tough conditions, mostly by going and selecting resistant species that he could find in the wild. And so that's one of the great things about doing what we do here, is finding populations, growing them from seed, and then seeing how those trees perform, and maybe they have wider use. So tough trees for tough places, that was his quote. He made several expeditions to China and even the Soviet Union to find new trees for urban situations. When you're down at the steamship, you'll see these vase-shaped trees. And the elms that he had selected, which have Chinese species, oftentimes mixed with the American elm, never grew to the great expansive tall heights of the American elm, particularly in what you see in nature, but they're kind of down in the steamship parking lot. They're salt resistant to both aerosol salts in the air, but also salts that are put down in the parking lot here. So these are trees that likely have their origins in the hybrids that Dr. Ware did several years ago. So I think it's a cool story that we see kind of the value of science, research, observation, documentation, and then the use of this to produce hardy street trees. Where do they come from in general? Well, I mentioned the swamp white oak grows in swamps. A lot of them come from floodplains, that is, riparian river corridors or river banks where they experience seasonal flooding. What does that mean? Well, When the roots are underwater for a good portion of their lives, they have anaerobic conditions, meaning no oxygen generally in the root zone. And what they've done within their own roots through these specialized structures, it's called orenchyma, it's part of the anatomy of these trees and the tissues, they've developed these pores that are larger to hold oxygen and store it and exchange it with the atmosphere. So common profile for urban trees is they often come from places that are wet, and that translates to poorly drained, compacted soils found in urban settings. So these trees are utilized for the evolutionary past history of adaptation to these conditions, and they're selected for their ornamental characteristics. One thing to realize, though, the root systems are nearly always a different genetically selected clone. So when you see a street tree planted in a city, it's two trees. It's kind of amazing to think. It's the understock, the root zone, which is usually a wild type species like Siberian elm, for instance, with a grafted scion, which is the selection of the above ground portion of the tree. So you're seeing two species kind of commingled, but put together for their utility and their survival. Examples are green ash, honey locust, which you see planted all over, the American elm, both red and silver maples, red maples native here, and the American sycamore. They're all floodplain trees that are well adapted to harsh conditions. Well, when I was at the Morton Arboretum, Dr. Ware was actively trying to get the nursery industry to take on several of his clones that he had made and had grafted. And so I wanted to tell you that most shade trees, it's really crazy. They're two different genetic components, the rootstock and the scion. They take nearly 9 years to kind of get to this stage. So year one, it's either cloned as tissue culture or cutting. It's put in an outdoor liner bed where it's grafted, which I'll show you in a moment how they do it. And they're lined out in the field, and there's trees, millions of trees that are produced in the Pacific Northwest because of the incredible rainfall and growth out there. So you can get a tree quite quickly using this methodology in a short period of time. Year 4, you establish a central leader because you want that tree to become a street tree. You root prune in year 5, and then as you get to year 6, you plant in the field. You also do some root pruning to eliminate what we call girdling roots, which are a problem with floodplain trees. And then they're kind of delimbed from the base up because they're going to be planted along a streetway for people to walk under. So typically what you see is a tree that goes out after 7 to 8 years as a 2-inch to 3-inch caliper tree, which I believe is the ideal size to move a plant for less stress. And then you have larger trees year 9. So it's about a 10-year cycle. And then you have people who prefer these bigger trees. You know, I have to tell you, you can put in a bigger tree, but you're going to have bigger problems with trees in terms of the time they need to adapt. One of the rules that the Morton Arboretum came up with, and I repeatedly tell people this, that overplant large trees. You know, people who want it now, they're not about the process. They often plant these big trees, and they did a study that for every 3 to 4 inch in caliper size, we'll call it diameter breast height. So this human being around here, if you put a caliper measure 3 to 4 inches, it's going to take that tree 3 to 4 years to resume normal growth once it's transplanted out of the ground with a ball. So they'll take this tree, put a ball, they'll have a basket around burlap, transfer this with a truck and plant it in a cityscape. And the longer or the larger the tree, the longer the time for recovery. And that's a big deal because when trees are stressed, particularly if they're not managed after they're planted, let's say an 8-inch to 10-inch tree, that means for 8 to 10 years, this thing is going to sit frozen in time. And at the same time, it's going to be struggling. When trees struggle, they often get pests and diseases. Actually, there's insects that sense the stressors in trees. They give off gases, and borers in particular go to those trees. So stay in this zone. A tree like this will outgrow a tree like this very easily. So a 2 to 3 inch tree will surpass this. So stick to the smaller, you save money and headaches. But the introduction of a tree from a program goes into breeding a plant like Dr. Ware did. This is one of his introductions, the London plane tree called Morton Circle or exclamation. It's a London plane or sycamore that has a kind of a narrow habit, which is useful for street trees. Breeding, observation, select them and say like, okay, this one has disease resistance, you review it, and the whole process. And I was on the Chicagoland Grows introduction committee. I was the head of the R&D group for my entire time there. It takes about 20 years to get a tree selected, and then through collaboration, you introduce it into the nursery trade. So that's kind of how these trees get to us. When I mentioned the graft, so you have the bottom of the rootstock, and then the top, which is the selection you want. So if you had, for instance, the Morton Circle sycamore, it's grafted onto probably native Platanus occidentalis, our native sycamore. And the hybrid is a hybrid of a plant that Dr. Ware found in China, Platanus orientalis, that was resistant to anthracnose disease, again, where it originated. And so what happens is this tiny little sliver of a Morton elm, it's called a chip bud. Sometimes it's called a splice graft, depending on how you want to graft it. It's taken from your clonal top portion. A slit is created in the bark like this. And it's often called tea budding, and they just put that right into that slit, cover it with paraffin wax, and you wait about 3 to 4 months, and that completely seals to the cambium, which means it'll start to knit together with the vascular system. Then they chop this off. It seems cruel, but kind. And then this grows into the street tree that you want on a wild type plant system. What is that advantage of the wild type root system? Anchorage, mainly. Oftentimes clones will be selected for a certain trait, but may not be able to be produced on their own roots, particularly anchoring roots that lock them into the soil and prevent them from actually blowing over. And also these wild type systems, the roots are more or less come from floodplains, as I mentioned. Well, here it is. And when you go out to Oregon and see these amazing tree farms, you can see in some of the slides I've had before doing this talk, Mount Hood in the background. It's an area that gets a ton of precipitation, has really good growing soils. And this is the actual Morton Circle exclamation, the narrow one that I talked about. And it's how he found this tree. He was working with the National Arboretum, and it was first observed in 1994. And this is planted all over the United States today. And it's a wonderful form. And it's a tree well adapted to urban conditions. Another benefit of Dr. Ware's research. Here we go, though, looking at his chip bud method. This is a male clone of ginkgo. Many of you probably are aware that ginkgo is a urban tough tree. This is a tree that's origins go back almost 200 million years. And so you would not be surprised that this has had some adaptations and some resiliency. We do know that female ginkgos are male and female on separate plants. Females produce a very odorous fruit that smells terrible. So they graft the male clones onto seedlings. So here are the seedlings, and they go down in this little wagon, and they have heat protection, and they cut them back. They take this little chip bud that I showed you. Here it is right here, a shield bud, I guess we'll call it. And they put it into this cavity and wrap it in paraffin. And then later those grow, and they cut off that top and let the scion, the male selection grow. And there, we said about 10 years, that tree's ready for transplanting. So when I was at the Morton Arboretum, we specifically looked at trying to get George Ware's elms into the nursery trade. This one's probably his most famous, called Accolade, and it is a hybrid. And so what they'll do is, these are about 2 to 3 inch trees. I'll often take these trees and dig them early in the spring when they're dormant, store them in these refrigerated buildings, and you get these bare root trees shipped to you in these tractor trailers. When I was a nurseryman, I planted hundreds of these trees at Michigan State University. I was there for 10 years, and we had had a terrible, terrible tree loss event because of a late 1988 drought that killed hundreds of trees on campus. So we got funding to replace those trees. And this is how they do it. They ship these to you, and then you plant them and stake them, and you can continue to kind of work these trees into a street tree form. This is a paper that you can find online. We can share a link later, but it's really pretty cool. It's talking about how, we know that human health and well-being is, really promoted by trees, just having trees around you. It's also kind of a social justice issue because poor areas of the country, oftentimes developed along highways and bridges, have had no green infrastructure investment. And so urban forests help, solve these issues that are societal. People living in communities affected by urban forests, developing solutions for them. Well, it's really kind of arboretum botanic gardens that should be involved with this. This is a publication called Plants, People, and the Planet. It's really kind of cool. Most of their stuff is free online, but it talks about improving, protecting existing trees. We should honor trees that have lived through lots of years, and particularly like old oaks and rare trees, improving tree selection with diversity and age structure. Most of our town trees on the island are in the last third of their life. And so we haven't been planting young trees to fulfill those next generations. Improving planning standards, training, and management, that's a large part of it. And also just giving horticulture and scientific knowledge to people to understand how botanic gardens and arboretum are sources for plant information. Here are the challenges, though, if you look at in this paper, restricted root space. So you see over here with my cursor, this grate, you see these metal grates in cities, and oftentimes they're not cut out and the trunk gets girdled. That's one of the problems. And then you have poor soil composition. Inside these tree pits should be arable soil that's kind of fluffy and not easily compacted. Cornell University, which I mentioned earlier, is the leader in producing a patented method called structural soils, structural engineered soils, where people can walk over them and they'll still have airflow. So that's an important part of planting, is replacing the soil in these soil pits to avoid soil compaction. You see people walking over the roots. That's a problem. One thing you may not be aware of, human foot traffic is probably the leading cause of tree death, along with our obsession with our lawns. So when we ask people to either get rid of their lawns or, put a soil mulch ring around the tree, we're doing it because that grass is not helpful to the tree. Poor surface permeability, lack of water infiltration, that comes with compacted soils. And then when you have these tall buildings, you have a lack of direct sunlight. So that's an issue. And then you often see this where a tree is just butchered, like right through here. So there's trees that naturally grow about 25 feet that don't even get into these wire situations. I would say most municipalities, in my old university, Michigan State, did this 35 years ago, bare your utilities and have more room for canopy growth. And so people say like, oh, we could never do that here. Well, there's funds available to put utilities underground. And my goodness, you see how these trees get butchered every year? And you're wondering like, wow, I think maybe we should consider another way of growing trees instead of putting them under power lines and expecting them to survive. With increased storms with climate change, more power outages, this would be helpful to eliminate the situation. Pollution comes from all over: vehicles, infrastructure, runoff. One thing that you might be aware of, but urban conditions, you have a 15 to 25 degree more heat in these areas. So if you can see that on Martha's Vineyard, if you're in Vineyard Haven, Oak Bluffs, or Edgartown, I jokingly refer to those areas as the banana belt because they, in their phenology, trees leaf out at least 10 days earlier, maybe 14 days earlier. This is both what we call phenology of bud break, also flowering occurs where those heat zones are because of the buildup of pavement that you see in cities. So our closest thing to urban cities are, our harbor towns, and that's where trees really, really struggle. So when trees struggle, I mentioned before, they're vulnerable to pest problems. So these are urban challenges. But what I want to talk about the benefits of trees for sustainable communities, when I talked about how we can kind of level the playing field and make people's worlds much better. And this particular paper, which, Liz can maybe share with you in the chat, it talks about the benefits of trees, and it promotes health, social well-being by removing air pollution, reducing stress. Also encourage physical activity. Nobody wants to go running out on a tarmac pavement. Also promotes social ties and communities in terms of everybody has equal access to the beauty, comfort of trees. Children with views of trees are more likely to succeed in school. Trees promote strong economies, and they provide several resources to people that need them. So the role of trees is only going to grow in its importance as climate changes here and elevating temperatures. Well, that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you about today in terms of tree diversity against adversity, and kind of tell you how trees over time can serve us in our communities in a greater way, and how we can kind of prepare by doing the work that Arboretum Botanic Gardens do of educating people about the value of trees. And so tomorrow we have our Arbor Day at Polly Hill, which is going to be very cool. It's a tour, tree planting and demonstration, and a tree giveaway. It's at noon tomorrow, and please come and bring friends. It's free. And I noticed that I saw in the paper that it's a tree seedling. We're giving away actually these pretty nice tree seedlings that are about 4 feet tall. So you will walk away with a beautiful mountain silverbell, which is a native tree to the southeast that is really just spectacular all seasons. It has these bell-shaped flowers that you see, and inside of these beautiful yellow stamens. It's called the Carolina Silverbell. I've had the opportunity to collect it in the wild. It won't grow here 60 to 80 feet. It will grow about 30 feet tall. We saw one in Falmouth today while we were driving to catch the boat. They're bell-shaped flowers that were set from the previous year's wood. The clusters are just incredible. They're beautiful. And then it has this really cool winged seed, and it's just one of our kind of rare and unusual trees that not enough people plant. So here's your opportunity. It's not invasive. In fact, it's actually difficult to grow from seed, not hard to clone. It has a growth habit where it's wide, I will tell you that. And I put down the height here as 20 to 30 feet, maybe 20-foot spread. I have one at home that's about 20 feet tall and about 15 feet wide, and it's about 12 years old, and it's a seedling from Polly Hill. They like full sun, a little wind protection, and they have beautiful green leaves and excellent fall color. So come by tomorrow and get a tree, and we'll show you how to properly plant the tree. It's just leafing out, so it's not like, wow, that tree looks like it's growing out of this world. It's a tree we got in as a bare root seedling. It's like we typically do, like in the nursery trade, and it'll be available for you tomorrow. We'd love for you to come get one. I'm going to end by saying thank you for listening to my talk about urban trees. And here is a site that's, couple weeks ago catching a early boat. Here's one of Dr. Ware's elms, I believe, doing very well in the most in hospital situation. So trees are the answer. I hope I provided some. And also you've got questions for me to answer. So I'm going to go back and let Liz take over for now. Thanks everybody for joining me tonight.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Tim. That was great. So we have some time for questions. So if you haven't added questions to the Q&A box and you have questions that you've thought of after listening to Tim's presentation, please add those in the Q&A. So the questions that we have so far, the first one is, how big of an area is needed to give the urban diversity that you mentioned? Is an area of 3 blocks enough, or are several acres worth of diversity and distance needed to prevent the huge loss you showed?
No, you can do it in a smaller subset of 3 blocks. It's that general rule of not going over 5%. Typically, though, what you'll see, and I agree with it, it's very difficult, particularly with wires in cities, if they still have high wires, to plant ... trees, one here, that's one next to it. So, I agree with kind of the design concept of putting like 4 of the species together, 4 trees in a row that are the same clone, and then another group of 4 that are another. I think that brings some kind of sense of design connectivity with these plantings. So yeah, you can just use that same formula that I gave you for a 3-block area to larger acreage. It's really a great rule of thumb.
All right. So we have someone who says that they had to join a little bit late, and they were wondering if you could speak about how you worked with Oak Bluffs to select their new street trees.
Well, with Oak Bluffs, that's an interesting story because that particular site is prone, being near the ocean, to 2 things: aerosol salts from the air affecting the trees, small root zone spacing, also salt on the streets. It's on Circuit Avenue, so they do salt the streets there. So the tree there, which is really kind of goes back to actually the Arnold Arboretum selecting a tree. It's called Ivory Silk. It's a lilac, and you're like, oh, lilacs are shrubs, they're bushes, but there are tree species of lilacs, and that particular one is Syringa reticulata. Was first brought into the Arnold Arboretum in Boston, and they noticed that this tree was very, very, very tough. It's been a really solid tree in terms of use in other communities. And in their case, in Oak Bluffs, they really needed to have it lower than 20 feet because they have the awnings of the storefronts there. So that's kind of just the block of trees. There's about 12. And I think it was okay in that situation to just use one type of tree. So I'm not sure if they planted them yet, but that was selected because of its long history of showing. And it's actually curious, a lot of plants in that family, which is called the olive family, Oleaceae, come from Mediterranean regions or areas by the ocean where they get salt. So that particular plant grows in Japan and China, just in a maritime conditions like we have. So it's well adapted.
All right, thanks, Tim. So our next question, what do you think of river birch for a wet area?
I love it. It's awesome. I just bought one. I can't deny it. Yeah, that tree, it does grow in riparian areas. It's not necessarily a good urban street tree. It doesn't like urban heat, but it's used, and often, if you can, I would recommend that you get one called Heritage, and that was selected by Earl Cully 30 years ago, and the bark is fantastic. It peels away like a lot of birches, and it's orangey and really interesting. And if you can get a multi-stem tree, and that's what I bought, I'm going to put it off the side of my deck. Now, I live in a droughty situation, so What you may want to do in terms of your soil, if you're not in a wet zone and you're in a dry zone like me and you want to grow river birch, is to actually add compost to the soil and give it some water retention qualities, and then mulch it and water it during drought times. But river birch, that was a tree that grew actually across the street from my parents' house along streams. And it's just a remarkable tree. Beautiful, good selection.
Nice. Okay, so it looks like we have one more question. If you could please explain again how after you splice the scion onto the rootstock, you cut off part of the tree. What are you cutting off?
So what you'll do is you'll see that with that shield bud or that chip bud knit together, and it will start to sprout out a branch. And what you do is you cut right above that about a 1/4 inch, maybe a little bit more. And so you essentially graft the tree onto that plant, let it knit together in terms of its vascular system. And then once you see it sprout out, it's like I said, it seems cruel to be kind. You cut it, and you cut it on an angle so the water won't actually coalesce on the bud. So you cut it on a slope away from the bud, and you allow that bud to sprout out. And if you look at urban trees and you get close to them, you'll see a little crook about 3 inches or more up, and that's the graft. And eventually you won't notice it at all. That scion will just knit so much that it's just a singular tree with a little bit of a crook, and that's the connection area that heals, and then the tree grows. So it's very common, and that's how they do it.
All right, thanks for explaining that again, Tim. All right, well, thank you, Tim, for answering all those questions. Thank you all for asking some good questions. If you missed it in the chat, I put the link to the article that Tim was talking about. So if you want to copy that in the next minute, so you have it. And then if there's anything that you missed and want to revisit in the webinar, it'll be on our YouTube website at Poly Hill Arboretum in the next couple weeks. So thank you all so much for joining. Thank you, Tim, and happy Arbor Day, everyone.
Yeah, be sure to come by tomorrow and get a beautiful Halit, like a 3-footer.
Yeah.
Trees are the answer. Plants are powerful. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.